Good morning if you are in the west coast of the United States, and good afternoon if you are in the east coast of the US, and good evening if you are joining us from across the ocean from Europe or Turkey. My name is Baki Tezcan. I teach history at the University of California in Davis. I also convene the various online meetings of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. And today I'm with you to introduce you our panel for What's Up series, What's Up in Ottoman and Turkish Studies. This is our 20th meeting. We started in November 2020, and now we are here in July 22 with a meeting focusing on a special dossier that appeared in, I hope you can see, uh, Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, Volume 8, Number 1. And you might say, this is now, I was going to say the last issue, but it is no longer the last issue because the next issue also appeared. A2 just appeared this week. So this is the last, the one before the last issue. And the special dossier's focus was Istanbul. Istanbul through the looking glass of the local. As you might have followed, our journal publishes has been publishing a special dossier in most of its issues. These dossiers are organized by an editor or sometimes two co-editors. This particular one was edited by my colleague Jeremy Walton, as he was leading a research group at the Max Planck Research Institute, Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious Ethnic Diversity. And the group that he led there from 2016 to 2022 was Empires of Memory, the Cultural Politics of Historicity in Former Habsburg and Ottoman Cities. He is no longer there. He moved to University of Rijeka in Croatia, or Rijeka. Maybe I pronounced that wrong. And Jeremy, please correct me when it's your turn. And now he is leading a different European Research Commission supported research group, Revivals of Empire, Nostalgia, Amnesia, Tribulation. He is also the author of a book that came out of Oxford University Press in 2017, Muslim Civil Society and the Politics of Religious Freedom in Turkey. We are very, very happy that the journal actually had a special dossier on modern contemporary Turkey, as we are actually Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. And so we are even more happy that an anthropologist actually was the editor of the special dossier, because we do want to do more with social sciences that focus on Turkey. So I am so grateful that Jeremy was able to take this on and put this amazing volume together. And by the way, this volume, the last, well, no longer the last, but the second to last issue, has many, many, many pages. And this is the achievement of the last editor, our last editor, Nükhet Barlık, who put together several sections in this issue. So you should definitely look at that issue. Our issues are available also on news, and I'm going to share with you on chat the link for both the issue that we will be focusing on today and also the most recent issue, the one that got published earlier this week, as we get started. Now I'm going to pass the sort of mic to Jeremy, but before I do so, let me also introduce our panel participants in order to not take more time than I should, because we are hoping that we can make everybody do their short summary of their pieces within the first hour. So we're going to keep the introductions very short. And our presenters, in order of their appearance, are Alize Arıcan from Boston University, Çiğdem Buğdaycı from University of Amsterdam, Nagihan Haliloğlu from İbn Haldun Üniversitesi, Çiçek İlengiz from Forum Transregionale Studien in Berlin, Susan Mariam Rosita Kalaycı from Oxford, University of Oxford, and Enno Meissen from Utrecht University. All right, Jeremy, please take it on.
Thank you so much, Baki. I can't express my gratitude for this opportunity to reunite by way of Zoom with my wonderful co-authors. And all of you, thank you, those of you who've joined us in the virtual audience. So I am going to both present the dossier very briefly and then also say a few words about my own contribution. Thank you for the kind introduction, Baki. It is true that I'm now at the University of Rijeka, or, well, some might call it Fiume if you have any interest in the Italian-Croatian matters. We can talk about that, though it's a different topic, where I'm continuing my long-standing fascination and research on post-imperial legacies and memories. And the volume that finally emerged with, I should say, the extraordinary shepherding and care of Nüket Varlık in 2021 was the ultimate outcome of a conference that we held at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen, Germany in 2017. It was wonderful to see so many of you there in person, and I hope we have an opportunity to gather in person again sometime soon. There were other members of the colloquium who in one way or another have found their way back to us as well. I should note that one of our authors, Ainur Deron, is on vacation at the moment and not able to join us, but if we need to ventriloquate her wonderful research on Teşvikiye Nişantaşı, I can perhaps do that. And I should also say that we invited all of the members of the special roundtable on Hagia Sophia, Hagia Sophia, which of course was particularly politicized at that moment and of course continues to be, to join us as well, not as formal participants, but as members of the conversation. I'm not sure if any of them have been able to, but I do want to very briefly acknowledge the contributions of Umut Azak, Patricia Blessing, and Ali Yaycıoğlu, Mary Donala, Marcus Dressler, Shannon Steiner, and Emily Neumauer, Bisera Pentcheva, Ipek Koca Ömer Yosmaoğlu, and Eldem Edem, who all contributed to that section. And I won't have time to get into any of the details, of course, but it's a wonderful, I think, collection of reflections on the way in which the Reconquista of Hagia Sophia in 2020 has reverberated, and it also silenced its multiple histories in various ways. So let me just share my screen quickly. Let's see here if I can do this. And then I need to go to, you're probably going to see all sorts of strange things, but if I go to, yes. As I mentioned, I'll be with relative brevity, and now I can't see all that I need to because of the way that Zoom, of course, conveniently obscures the very words that you're focusing on. Very briefly introducing the dossier, and then also briefly, very briefly speaking about my own contribution. So the whole point of, I think, Istanbul Through the Looking Glass was within the broader sort of sensibility and esprit de coeur of the Empires of Memory project, to examine the ways in which collective memory and heritage discourse, which we can think of in some sense as the pressure that the present exerts upon the past, the ways in which that pressure on the past was contradicting, domesticating, sanitizing, but also in some sense perhaps silencing and coming into tension with the legacies of the city of Istanbul in a variety of ways and a variety of contexts, particularly with a focus on the distinct spaces and places, mahaleler, sites within the city. So one thing that I actually regret not having done in the introduction to the essay is reflecting a bit more on the looking glass inspiration, which actually does have a relationship. The general notion being that if you take specific sites such as Tarlabasi, such as Fener, Balat, such as the Adalar, such as Nişantaşı, Teşvikiye, and so on, and examine Istanbul through their lens, you have this sort of refracting looking glass effect, whereby the general sort of discourses that attempt to, in some ways, situate and homogenize the city are rendered strange through those looking glasses. There are some other things, though, about the looking glass metaphor and invocation that are worth pointing out. You have, of course, the famous caterpillar smoking the nargile on the toadstool, which is a strange gesture to a certain Orientalism of the time. You have Humpty Dumpty, who is sitting with his legs crossed like a Turk. But finally, and perhaps most fascinatingly, you have this moment with the Jabberwocky, and I quoted it here, though I actually can't see it due to the way that my screen sharing is working out. But this word, did gyre and gimble on the wave, in some sort of false etymology at some point. Lewis Carroll actually connected the word gyre that he used here to gyaur or gavur, which had been introduced to English by his close friend Byron. And in some sense, this is meant to be like the sort of undulations of a dog, that is to say, an infidel dog. That's what he claimed in one of the etymologies. I should cite my friend Kevin Kenyar, who pointed this out to me. So anyway, this is just one of these strange moments that I think the looking glass metaphor gets us. I'm fond of these sort of very unusual connections and points of contact. So in the introduction, I talk about the silhouettes and the submersions of Istanbul as a sort of metaphor for thinking through these two different ways of relating present and past. Here you have a few of these silhouettes, which have in some ways tried to render the city homogeneous, to knead that very thick and heterogeneous historical dough into a single sort of memory. Of course, you all know about Çamlıca Cami with its 107.1 meter tall minarets, gesturing, of course, to Manzi Kurt, or the battle between the Byzantines and Selçuks in 1071. You have this notion that the historical silhouette has to be protected from the skyscrapers in Zeytinburnu that became an issue in 2016, I believe it was. But the whole point of this is that Pamuk, whom I invoke, in the 90s, claiming that there was no such thing as a silhouette that united the city of Istanbul, has been rendered a bit anachronistic in recent years, as Istanbul has become the object of what you might think of metaphorically as these projects of silhouette making. So even when you have something that romanticizes the sort of heterogeneity, Istanbul, they call it chaos and we call it home, it's still about the silhouettes. Instead, I think we want to go to the submersions. And this is where I follow again in the introduction from the Black Book, Galip's descent into the Bosphorus, where you have this sort of plenitude of history, from the Ligurian soldiers to Orthodox priests to gangsters and malls embracing in a kiss forever. You find everything in the Bosphorus. Now, I've given you something here that's actually not from the Bosphorus, but rather an Airbus that was sunk intentionally off of Kuşadası in 2016 or so, and has become this site. But it's a nice sort of image to sort of have as a placeholder for this very different relationship to the past. I've also given you a tattoo that points out this double current of the Bosphorus, another metaphor that I think we can seize on, which Neil Asherson in his wonderful book The Black Sea talks about how you discover in the 16th century, it was an Italian scientist, these double currents pulling in both directions, another rich metaphor for the city. Incidentally, it was Black Sea Tattoo that did that tattoo. So there's a Black Sea connection there as well. I won't go into this because I'm talking too long already, Baki, I'm sure. But my own contribution is to think through Sveti Stefan, or the Demir Kilise there in Balat, as a site of problematic heritage, one that should be a bit more difficult than it is in some sense in Sharon McDonald's terms. So here you see the opening ceremony after the restoration of the church in 2018, where you had Erdogan, Borisov, the Prime Minister of Bulgaria, you had the Patriarch, you had Binali Yildirim and so forth, all gathering together to celebrate this sort of what was framed as the efflorescence and recrudescence of Ottoman era sort of Belle Epoque tolerance. That's what Nora Fisher-Ono would call it, this Belle Epoque image of Ottoman multiculturalism and neo-millet pluralism. I consider the achievement of this opening, I actually can't read this because of the way my screen is, but an assertion of the character of Istanbul as a city where different religions and cultures live together. Well, throughout my argument, and I won't be able to go into any detail now, but I sort of examine both the prehistory of the church in the intra-millet controversies between Bulgarians and Greeks in the late 19th century, the emergence of the exarchate that established Bulgarian Orthodoxy as separate from the patriarchate up the hill in 1870, and therefore the imperative on having a house of worship of their own. The fact that the church itself was assembled in so many different inter-imperial sites, including Vienna, as you see here, but also with the iconostasis created in Moscow and so on and so forth, to sort of think through the difficult and not entirely congenial histories that are embodied in this building, but that are not picked up by this sort of homogenizing and sanitizing discourse of multiculturalism in the present. So again, my apologies for being a bit long-winded. I tried to sort of speed it up there at the end. I know that we want to get to each of our contributors. So now I will turn things over. I'll stop sharing my screen and turn things over to our first speaker, which I believe is Alize Arijan. Is that correct? Alize, hello, please.
Hello, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's really a special pleasure to speak with you about my article. So, I will keep my comments as brief as possible, and for the sake of time, I'll assume a certain familiarity with the Tarlabasi neighborhood of Istanbul. And I can take questions in the Q&A if you'd like. I'll just share my screen and we can get going. Okay, it's good. Cool. So in my article, Rumor as Archive, my goal was to pay close attention to how histories might be emerging in a Tarlabasi still in the making. And what I mean by that is, a neighborhood that we don't take for granted as erased, done, or over. And the answer, I contend, lies in rumors. So throughout my ethnographic research, I came to witness and in some ways participate in rumors about Taksim 360, which is the ongoing urban transformation project, a part of which you see on the left. And a part, something that's in sort of a juxtaposition to lives still being lived in the neighborhood. I repeatedly heard Tarlabasi's residents say that Taksim 360 was not necessarily complete, especially as the construction project was extended again and again. And meanwhile, residents have begun producing and circulating stories and rumors about it, particularly as they started to establish relationships with workers in the construction site. Continually circulating across Tarlabasi, these rumors form and index residents' own narratives of their neighborhood's history. In other words, through rumors, residents produce their own historical knowledge about themselves. They not only archive structural ruptures, but also articulate malleable experiences of the past that generate future-oriented expectations. Today, I'll give you a snapshot of one particular rumor, the story of the Golden Cross. Ibrahim runs a kebab shop on what is officially a street, but looks more like an alley. When Taksim 360's scaffolding went up, it swallowed a significant portion of the street, making it look this way. He shares those steps with a tea shop right at the corner where Tarlabasi Boulevard meets the end of Taksim 360, if you're coming from Taksim Square. The shop's location created a certain sensibility in him. Every day, he paid attention to the daily activities of his neighbors in the neighborhood and in the construction. Take that one day at 5 p.m. As I had learned throughout my days working with him at the shop, the workday was over in Taksim 360. 3 men in high-vis vests and hard hats came out of a hidden door in the scaffolding. They exchanged greetings in Kurmanji with Ibrahim, then left to return home despite his invitation to tea. As if that reminded Ibrahim of something, as soon as they left, he said, well, what I was telling you, well, I never told you about the golden cross in there, have I, as I was telling you about the stories in this construction site. And then he went on to tell me about a church that was supposedly found during the construction. Not a big one that you would ordinarily notice, but a smaller one, more of a chapel. I've done construction work, you see, and I know that even when you do restoration, you have to dig it up a little bit to see if something needs strengthening or whatever, he said. The young construction workers whom he befriended over the years told him that one day, someone they knew found this huge cross completely made up of first-class gold. Who knows how much it was worth? And these huge paintings of Jesus, so historical and so important, he said. Ibrahim's eyes were wide open with excitement as he stretched his arms to illustrate the cross's grandiose size. He said, it was obviously so valuable that the managers of the construction took the workers out of there immediately. Then the company overseeing the project banned anyone from doing any work in the church effective immediately. So the friends of my friends never saw these things again, but they took some pictures. He reached out to his phone, opened the photo gallery, and showed me a couple of pictures of paintings of Jesus. No cross, but very close up, poor little pictures that I couldn't help but think couldn't have been taken anywhere. See, he said excitedly, even when the state or whoever tries to get rid of the people who made Tarlabasi, they can't get rid of how valuable they made this place. They can't get rid of this history. It will always prevail and stay behind. Our people, and I mean not just for Kurds, but anyone who lived in these streets, will always find a way to leave something behind. That's why this construction is going on, and even if it ended, it will always be this way. The rumors about the cross and the image that he believed proved them to be true, did the work of attaching meaning to history for Ibrahim. This image was a fragment of the debris of a long past involving the numerous communities of Tarlabasi, thought to be displaced and erased. Yet that past could not be so easily molded in Ibrahim's view. This debris attested to the durable and tangible forms through which pasts are in the making by communities themselves. So the past is constantly remade through the words of a friend or a friend of a friend or the circulation of blurry cell phone photos. As long as rumors circulated, verbally or visually, they contributed to an ever-changing archive of the ways in which people would leave something behind, making places important, to quote Ibrahim. And in doing so, rumors urge us to reconsider who gets to make histories through which tools. I'll leave it at here, and I'm happy to speak more about it in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alize. I think now from Tarlabasi, we head slightly to the southwest to Eyüp with Chidem, if I'm not mistaken. Please, Chidem.
Yes, hello everyone. It's very nice to be here. Well, I'd like to thank you, Jeremy, for all these efforts in bringing this edition to reality. And I would like to thank David Gutman for his editing my article, and also Nükhet Varlık for actually taking the trouble to bringing my volume to Istanbul after the courier failed to do so. So I'll just share my screen. I don't have much presentation here. There is a PowerPoint I prepared, but only a few photographs here. This is the photograph of Eyüp Sultan from 1928. It's a new, sorry, I wrote Newsweek, it's the wrong one. It's National Geographic. I'm going to read my presentation to you. It will be a little bit dense, and I hope not to go beyond 8 minutes. My article concerns death and life, memory and history, the divine and the secular in contemporary Istanbul. I consider them not as binary opposites, but rather as mutually inclusive categories that involve a variety of perspectives on the temporality of the city. While modern Istanbul is a densely populated urban city with its skyscrapers, business and entertainment life, and hasty pace, Ottoman graveyards, especially sanctums, are spaces of slow time. Cats lazily sleep under cypress trees. There are fragrant roses on graves, while devotees contemplate or pray in silence. This relationship with the dead, particularly with the saints, Evliya, is the topic of my article. I consider them to not only reflect the history of the city as an urban, political, religious center, but also the way people from all walks of life give meaning to themselves and their lives. Life with the dead is a paradox for the modern secular mind. According to the secularization thesis, which was popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and which shaped many of the modernizing nations like Turkey, superstitious and irrational beliefs would gradually decline, and religious beliefs and practices would be a private matter, separating clearly the secular sphere from the religious sphere. Although this was indeed logical and reasonable at the time, scholars have recently found it necessary to revise the secularization thesis because many nations around the world either did not follow the Enlightenment path of abandoning religion and superstitious beliefs or found new ways to enchant their lives. As a result, Charles Taylor refers to it as a subtraction theory because removing an aspect of culture, especially one as important as religion, is impossible. Jane Bennett focused on another aspect of it, questioning whether modernity is indeed disenchanted. And the secularization thesis itself is another story that we believe in, which creates a distance to the effective possibilities of an enchanted life. Jeremy Walton has pointed out that each religious space has a specific story and history with which the subjects interact, emphasizing that it is a practiced place. The politics of religious space, as well as problems of identity and memory, are particularly relevant today. In my article, I have focused on one specific tomb, Eyüp Sultan, the standard bearer for the Prophet Muhammad, one of his beloved companions, and the patron saint of Ottoman Istanbul. I won't go into the detail of this, but it had a political role, the tomb, in Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, as it established the link between the Byzantine city and the Islamic past. It hosted the girding ceremony of the sultans, and it still continues to receive contemporary politicians today. As I mentioned earlier, the veneration of saints is problematic in modernity. So who are the Evliya and how do they challenge modern secular thought? Evliya literally means one who helps, protects, and is helped and protected. In Turkish, other words such as eren, ermiş, hakarenler, and aşık are also used. Their difference from ordinary people in Sufi terminology rests on their fulfillment of the purification of the soul, seyr-ü-sülük. By this, they attain the metaphorical death of desires while gaining eternal life by becoming friends of God. As a result, even after they die, they watch and hear those who pray to them. This is further proven by their keramet, saintly miracles, which they may perform when they're alive or physically dead. In this understanding, there is a hierarchy among people, and according to Shahab Ahmed, it indicates a de facto acknowledgement of and participation in the hierarchical cosmologies of Sufism. Kemalist critique of religion targeted this relationship between the saints and their devotees and outlawed all turbas and zawiyas and officially closed them on the 30th of November 1925. The law was in effect until 1950, when many of the sultans and Eyüp Sultan's tomb were reopened for visitation. Rejecting the veneration of saints as a superstitious and a pre-Islamic tradition was not only the view of the Kemalist regime, but also the view of the state institution, Diyanet, religious affairs, and Islamists. While Diyanet has attempted to discipline visitors, forms of Islamism have considered it inauthentic. Therefore, it is more appropriate to call the objection to saint veneration as modernist rather than merely secularist. What is at stake here between the modernizing policies and visitations of Türbestan is two different understandings of time and history. Instead of the linear progressive time of the modernists, the theocentric vision in the saint veneration points to divine infiniteness and mortal momentariness. Just like the saints, religious spaces are also treated in this divine present. Visitors interpreted the restriction on Türbes as just being physically unable to approach the tomb, rather than an obstacle to praying to the saints and requesting their intercession in Med. As the saints are not limited to time and space, their devotees can pray to them from anywhere. Furthermore, as Pierre Nora notes, memory is actual social phenomenon, whereas history is the reconstruction of the past. Both the ban on the Türbes and resistance to it in various ways display this interplay between memory and history. Many popular stories and urban legends still circulate about the uncanny resistance of saints to Republican secularization and urbanization efforts. What you see in the picture, I can't see it right now, but it's from 1928, and I wrote Newsweek wrong. It must be National Geographic. And it shows how easy it was to disobey the ban, as it was possible to pray in front of the Hacet Penceresi. This is the new, 2022 photograph of Hacet Penceresi. As you can see, there are two small windows within the window, and you can actually look at the tomb itself. So being in front of it equals actually being inside the tomb. There is not so much difference. The difference between secularity and religious belief thus shapes various understandings of history, time, and the existential reality of the world. As mentioned in the beginning, what is at stake is the understanding of the world as either an enchanted or disenchanted place, which juxtaposes belief with reason. According to this enchanted perspective, saints are no more than just part of a belief system. They are active agents of experience, especially when they become visible sites of counter-memory that challenge the top-down modernization and the Weberian disenchantment of the world. The history of saint tombs in the 20th century thus displays processes of desacralization, desecration, and resacralization, whereas their memory is often one of a continuous set of meanings and associations. Despite any attempts to control and discipline it, the pre-modern habit of visiting saints coexists with modern temporalities in Istanbul. So the question is, does this imply that an enchanted modernity is possible, and that modern individuals already distinguish sites as enchanted and disenchanted and act accordingly, making contemporary Istanbul a site that shares the temporalities of both the pre-modern and modern? Thank you, that was it. Let me stop my share.
Thank you so much, Chidem. So continuing on the shores of the Golden Horn, I believe if my sense of alphabetical order is in order, we'll go now to Nagihan, who will take us to Fener Balat, perhaps Balat in particular. Nagihan, please.
Hi, I wonder if you're seeing my presentation. Yes, let me make it bigger. Great, so mine is on the palimpsest, so I thought I would start with a palimpsest. So you can see you've got Greek, you've got my English writing in front on top of it. So mine is a comparative literature approach to it, as it was, or you were going to see a lot of words rather than pictures. Right, so the aim of my paper was to find local terms to express aspects of time-space relationship, or the chronotope, one of my favorite things. So briefly, what the chronotope is, Bakhtin defines it, if we can call it a definition. So he says, in the literary artistic chronotope, spatial and temporal indicators are fused into one carefully thought out concrete whole. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. And I use and abuse this quote throughout the paper and sort of elsewhere in my work. So of course he's writing about texts, and I carry it back to the space of Balat. And I mine or do my archaeology mostly on Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. In the paper, I touch a little bit on what the Byzantines have written, or sort of travelers to the Byzantine Empire have written. And then I've got stuff on the Ottomans, how Evliya Çelebi has described Balat, but mostly I'm focusing on Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar's writing, because he was a novelist, but also a literary theorist. I think it's very important to see sort of what kind of concepts he uses. And by the way, Baki and Jeremy, if I go too long, please stop me. So just
one little thing. One of the participants wrote, could you make it the slide full? If you go to
even bigger, yes.
Slideshow, I think.
Oh, don't make me do that. I want to see my little
Okay,
thumbnails there.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Keep going. Don't worry
Okay.
about it.
So this is a bit bigger. Right. So the three concepts that I have identified in Tanpınar are Terkip, Macera, and Buhran. And I think these concepts sort of come are kind of some kind of analogs to the things that Bakhtin talks about, not just Bakhtin, but also Foucault talk about when they talk about spaces and the responsiveness to time. So, and multiplicity through time and space. I look at these through the concepts of palimpsest and chronotope, and heterotopia, and that comes from Foucault. So these are all concepts that I look at the writing on Balat rather. So they are useful tools to understand the layers that can be seen in Balat. And yeah, writing about a Turkish neighborhood alerts us to Turkish or Constantinopolitan methods of reading the multiplicity of spaces. And I posit, let's say, Tanpınar's use of terkip and macera to palimpsest and the chronotope. Right. So if we look at, I'm guessing you all know about the palimpsest, and we've got dear Sarah Dillon, who's come up with the concept of the palimpsestuousness, the palimpsestuous. So writing about the palimpsest is writing on the palimpsest of partaking in its history of adding a layer. So all these writings on Balat, they themselves form a palimpsest in Dillon's sort of understanding. And it's interesting, the palimpsest can be seen in the fields of manuscript, geology, and also psychology. And Freud uses the word comparing city and mind. And I will not go into this, but it's interesting that Freud also makes a reference to palimpsest. And we have what I call affective bonds throughout writing on Balat, particularly this idea of hüzün. So we all know, you will always refer to Pamuk, of course, but it's interesting how the hüzün of the Byzantines, when the horrible Crusaders came, and then when, the horrible Turks came, that is kind of connected to how early Republicans were feeling about how they were losing sort of the Ottoman traces. So there's this kind of lineage of hüzün as well. Then I have more concepts, heterotopia and heterochronism from Foucault. I find them also sort of useful to work with, particularly this line from Foucault. He says, there are heterotopias in which time does not cease to accumulate, perching, so to speak, on its own summit. And I think Istanbul, particularly Balat, is a heterotopia. And I'm really interested in how time accumulates in this space. Right. Great, and I've gone faster than I thought. Great. So I want to share a few paragraphs from Tanpınar to see how he uses the concept of terkip, meaning compoundedness, as it were, and these are my translations. So he says, there can be very few things that can be as educational as a stroll in the dingy neighborhoods of Istanbul. For in all their state of neglect and ruin, they give you the whole history layer by layer. So he does sort of name layer by layer, sort of making me think of palimpsest. The old empire and Tanzimat live side by side with the business of money making, that most forceful aspect of the latest period, and is writing in the 1940s. He has, if you know his writing, he keeps talking about our new life and our old life, and the old Istanbul. Of course, he means Ottoman Istanbul. Old Istanbul was a terkip. This terkip had been born out of several elements commingling together, small and big, of import and silly, new and old, local and foreign, beautiful and ugly. Behind this terkip was Islam and the institution of the empire. So empire is a very, very important element in the palimpsest, as you will find anywhere, particularly, you know, in the lands ruled by the Ottoman Empire. As I said, he uses terkip and majera. So here I think he kind of expands on the term majera. In a period when we experience the majera in modern Turkish meaning adventure, but I take it to mean chronotope, as I said, of a change of civilization with all its attendant buhran. And buhran means crisis. And this again links us back to heterotopia, because Foucault also talks about crisis heterotopia, you know, where moments of crisis are lived in places that are neither here nor there. And in a way, neighborhoods like Balat, and, you know, we've just seen Tarlabasi, they are crisis spaces. They're buhran spaces. They're crisis heterotopias. It is natural that what we understand to be beautiful is of secondary importance. Life continues with one terkip established after another. Beautiful is the miracle of these terkip. People can be worthy of this beauty only by being themselves in moments of self-reflection. Okay. Right. And I think I'm going to finish with this, just throw another concept at you. Sort of these are sort of very associative responses to Tanpınar's work, if you will. So this paragraph, for instance, reminds me of the way Derrida uses hauntology. Okay, so he's talking about Balat neighborhood and sort of other spaces near Fatih. I saw the trajectory of these neighborhoods as a symbol. How much time, how many incidents of history were needed to give this face to a single neighborhood of a city? How many conquests, how many defeats, how many migrations had caused these people to congregate here? After what destructions and constructions had these neighborhoods gained this aspect? How many deaths, how many farewells with no return, how many souls missing home did it have to experience for the face of a neighborhood to ripen that like that of a fruit or a human being? And I shall leave it here. Yeah, we can move on to Suzanne. How do I stop share?
There should be.
Yeah, got it. Got it.
Go. Thank you so much, Nagihan, for this haunting presentation. We're reluctant to terk etmek. No, I can't make it. Terk etmek. There must be a relation there. But anyhow, we're going to switch the order briefly, just because I know that Suzanne Mariam Rosita has to leave a bit early. So we'll move to her now. We'll board a vapor or a ferry boat on the Golden Horn, but head toward the Princess, the Adalar, at least that sort of makes sense, although we're also wandering around Beyoglu with Liji Pulju Çizmeciyan. Please, Meryem.
Yes, hi. Thanks for the travels around Istanbul that our panel is just putting me on. I think that's really beautiful. Beautiful memories are coming up for me. I'm calling in from Oxford, from my home, and I'm really excited to be here today. I didn't prepare a fancy presentation, but I think it works with my essay because I tried to in this essay, I had this question when Jeremy was asking me to write for the volume, and of course also to present at this amazing workshop that we had together. I had one question that when I read it to you, it probably doesn't make sense, but you know, as a writer, you always have one question and somehow you want to find some answers to it. And my question was, how to live in a city without it. And so when I first read the memoir Ligia wrote, I was just thinking to myself, the memoir, I don't know if any of you have read my essay or read her memoir, but the memoir is basically kind of like a long running list of what is no longer Istanbul, what we no longer can see in Istanbul. So if you want to go back to an Istanbul that I have never witnessed in my generation, not even as a baby, then the book of Ligia is really, really beautiful. But it was very difficult for me to write about it because it is really just listing things that are no longer there. But then I also left Istanbul behind. And so for me, reading her memoirs were again coming to this question of how to live in a city, but without it, because I feel like we are still inhabiting the spaces that we have lived throughout our lives, even if we no longer live in those spaces. So this was kind of my initial question. And I just wanted to write an essay around that, bringing my memories, my firsthand memories and Ligia's firsthand memories together. But how I found out about her book was basically on a visit to my auntie's place on Beyoglu, and Ligia is the upstairs neighbor, and she knew that I was working on Armenian literature, and she said, hey, by the way, I wrote a book. And I looked at this woman up in the balcony. I said, really? And she said, yeah, I wrote a book. And then, you know, I'm an Armenian woman and I wrote a book about Istanbul. And I was like, when did you write it? And she said, just a couple of years ago. And I was like, how old are you? She's like, over 90. And I was so fascinated with a woman starting her writing life basically at age at age 90. And so I walked up and on my way up, just one stair up to her flat, I had so many questions. I wanted to ask her so much about what it means to be Armenian in a city, what it meant to live in Turkey for the last 90 years. So this was in 2014 when we met, basically 90 years after her birthday. So she was born 1 year after the Republic was established, and her life has seen all the changes that we now think of, you know, kind of being the foundation of the history of modern Turkey. So I had so many questions, you know, when you walk up the stairs and suddenly you have 1,000 questions and you're like, oh my God, this is my chance of, you know, revisiting the city and revisiting the history of Turkey. And I walked into her door and suddenly, and there's a line in my essay where I say silence stood between us. And I knew exactly when I walked over the threshold of her door, that I will not ask any of the questions that I would like to ask, but that I still want to have the conversation. So this is kind of the beginning of this essay. And I have a few sentences that I structured the essay around a few sentences, and I just wanted to pick up a couple of those sentences and describe you the context of the writing around those sentences. But I also want to say that I wrote this essay while my father was dying in Turkey. So it came at a difficult time for me. And I was really glad that I had kind of the shelter of writing about Ligia. And my father, of course, knew her as well. So it was, but it's now looking at the essay, I feel like I still need to work a little bit on it. But let me just give you a couple of sentences from the essay and give you the context of it. So one of the sentences was, I tried to fill in some of the gaps in her narrative that she gave me on that afternoon, but I have left her silences be. And I think this kind of speaks to the idea of us sometimes wanting to know a lot, but then also, this kind of need between wanting to know, but also respecting someone's privacy, and maybe not wanting to intrude, because wherever you want to intrude, kind of as a voyeur, that might be a place of pain, and we shouldn't be going there. Another sentence that I have in the beginning of my introduction is, her memories of Istanbul are memories shared in the first person. And this kind of underlies that she's probably one of those women who know Istanbul in first person, the Istanbul that we don't know. So it's this idea of an archive that lives within us, even if the city no longer is there. And another sentence was, perhaps some things take living long enough to write about and even longer to forget. And this kind of speaks to her becoming a writer when she was 90. And suddenly she told me during our interview, or during our conversation over tea, she said, I wrote a page and then another and another and another. And now she actually has published 3 books about Istanbul. So this idea of sometimes maybe you take up something because it takes a really long time to be able to write about it. And Ligi's story is the story of an Armenian woman who is Catholic and who basically grows up in a little small Armenian community before she goes to school, but then moves away from that Armenian community and goes to a Catholic school. And here I wrote, with school, her life transformed from something familiar and insular. So this idea of, the family protecting her. And suddenly when she steps into her school, she steps into an existence that both felt more expansive, so more broad for her, but also more common. And it was really beautiful to watch that in her writing, that when she's a child, this protected child, and suddenly she's no longer Armenian, but she is in Istanbul, and she is in Catholic, and taking on that Catholic identity. Here I want to kind of underline that she's the only Armenian woman who wrote a memoir, but also the only Catholic who wrote a memoir about Istanbul. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And religion plays a big role in her memoir. So one of the sentences speaking to that is, religion in the modern world is like a negotiation for the unknown land that is to be the future. And for her, that was a possibility. I mean, stepping into a Catholic school, meeting a very famous Belgian French nun called Emmanuelle, who is very famous in the world, and New York Times has written a lot about this nun. And then meeting Papa Roncalli, who of course later becomes Pope. Meeting both of them basically gave her the possibility of kind of imagining her future. And during our conversation over tea, she said meeting both of them showed her what she could become, right? So it's really important, those people that you meet when your world is opening up. And then while I was meeting her in 2014, of course, we had a lot of movement. I mean, the Syrian war was getting worse and worse and worse. And so when I was sitting there and listening to Ligi's story about Roncalli, who was very famous of, giving Catholic Baptist certificates to Jews during the Second World War, I was a bit involved in bringing Syrians to Europe. And so it was this idea that 2 lives, she's telling me the life of Roncalli, and me, kind of also having to deal with the refugee crisis and a war of my own time. So this idea of history and memory intersecting with each other. And there the line is from an American poet called Susan Howie, and the line goes as, history intersects with unanswered questions while life possesses us. And this kind of underlines that as historians, of course, we are also humans, right? And that we that this rupture of memory in history is always and needs to be present in our times, as it is in, of course, Ligi's memoir. So with this, I kind of wanna stop because I know that I probably have talked quite a bit, but do read her books. And if I have to appear, I think 15 minutes, 10 minutes past, but if anybody has questions about the essay and want to read an updated version of the essay, please email me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mariam. This was appropriately Proustian, and you know, this kind of extraordinary connection through Ligi's memoirs of Ataturk on the one hand and Pope John the 23rd on the other. It's just really speaks to the kind of themes that we wanted to highlight in the issue. So now we will remain on Büyükada, if that's appropriate. I know you had some conversations there, but move to Çiçek İlengiz. And I should say that Çiçek is a particularly special member of our colloquium, since she was also a member of the Empires of Memory group during our time in Göttingen. So it's especially wonderful to see you here again today, Çiçek. Please.
Thank you, Jeremy, for bringing us together in this special issue, and thanks for organizing this roundtable. It has been a pleasure to be part of it. So basically, this special issue gave me the chance to go back to one of my earlier research on Istanbul. And the site that I will be talking about is the Fabiato Mansion, which is situated at Büyükada. So it's currently serving as the local courthouse of the Prince Islands, Büyükada Adalar Adliyesi. The research I have conducted for this article draws back to 2013, when the mansion was still called the Büyükada Culture House and remained mainly closed due to financial problems. I got to know about the Fabiato Mansion when I was an intern at the Ottoman Bank Research Center, which later became South Research. My first encounter with the private archive of Fabiato family was dreamlike for a young history student who was fascinated by micro-historical accounts of everyday life. A sahaf brought shapeless boxes of documents belonging to the Fabiato family that he found by chance on a trash can. Knowing that the center would be interested in these dusty, deformed documents written in Greek, French, Ottoman, and Italian languages, he asked for quite a considerable amount of money. Following the negotiations, the private archive of the Fabiato family was acquired by the center, and along with other colleagues, I cataloged its documents. And thanks to the amazing digitization team, the entire archive is available online, free of charge now. While engaging with the documents produced mainly by Spiridon Fabiato, who was a former Ottoman bank officer, and his adopted daughter, Aurora Fabiato, I started becoming curious about the material heritage that Fabiato family left behind, and started tracking the story of the mansion that is called the Fabiato Mansion. The archival documents that you see examples from on the slides give us ideas about everyday life details, family matters, property relations, problems related to taxations, and problems of legal identity for a Levantine family lived in Istanbul from the late 1800s to mid-1900s. But since the Fabiato mansion started changing hands following the decease of Aurora Fabiato in 1977, tracking the process of mansion's transformation into a culture house required further archival research, first at the title deed office, Tapu Dairesi, and municipal archive, Belediye Arşivi. And after failing in each of them, it further required collecting oral history accounts. What archival documentation was not rather covering were the different stages that led the dispossession of the mansion, in contradiction to the will of Gemma Fabiato, the wife of Spiridon Fabiato, to bequeath it to the San Pacifico Catholic Church, and Aurora Fabiato's attempt to bequeath the mansion to the family who was in charge of the maintenance of the mansion. In coherence with the story of the Fabiato's family archive, the Fabiato mansion was first wasted in order to be preserved. Following the decease of Aurora Fabiato, a trustee, a qayyum, was appointed to check the mansion, while a court case was initiated by the state, which ended by refuting the possible inheritors. During this court case period, the mansion was abandoned and dilapidated. At the beginnings of the 1990s, different branches within and outside of the state started showing interest to this dilapidated building. The winner of this competition was the touring automobile company, one of the significant actors of the time in the field of culture and restoration. Touring appeared in the history of the Fabiato mansion as the heroic actor, saving the building from being dismantled by transforming it into a culture house. Following a short restoration period in 1990, the Büyükada Culture House vernissage was celebrated with a ballet performance, which was framed as an act of bringing back the authentic culture of the Prince Islands to its original place. I approached to the story of the Fabiato mansion through the lenses of scholarly discussions on disputed heritage, and argue that this is one of the cases that forces us to rethink the conceptual links between heritage and inheritance, as well as waste and preservation. Due to the terminology that is promoted by the national and global regimes of heritage, we usually think of inheritance within the private realm and heritage within the cultural one. However, in cases of disputed heritage, this fast transition between private and cultural is usually possible through obscuring property relations. In addition, in this case, we see that the abandonment and mansions turning into a rubble played a fundamental role in redistribution and repurposing of the building. I think that this opens up the possibility to think further about dispossession and disinvestment as integral parts of heritage making practices. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Çiçek. We're running slightly behind, but I think it's all well. We'll now board the ferry, head back toward Karaköy, then we'll get on the funicular and head up the hill and join Enno Maaßen, excuse me, as we talk about the both the German I'm getting the name mistaken, but you'll tell us, as well as Galatasaray Lisesi. Enno, please.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the introduction, and I really appreciate that I can talk about my contribution to the special issue, and also have somewhat of a reunion of our workshop in Göttingen, which is now already close to 5 years ago. So in this article, I focus on processes and representations of placemaking in Beyoglu in the period following the 1950s through the lens of two communities. So as you may know, notions of Beyoglu as a place of decay, destruction, and vulgarity are important and broader historical representations of the area. Yet these representations are nuanced or contradicted also by both economic and demographic statistics and qualitative state cases, which I will discuss 2 examples with you here. So, I also need to figure out, yep. So I have shown in this article that for 2 communities, the self-defined community of Galatasaraylı and a sizable part of the German-speaking community in Istanbul, connected through the Teutonia Club, the Beyoglu district was of crucial significance as this place of social gathering in Istanbul, and even contrary to what predominant representations of the district in the second half of the 20th century suggest, also retained this functionality by and large. Now, to kick off with the case of Galatasaray High School, we see that the school's building and the district in broader terms is of pivotal importance to students and graduates' sense of belonging. And they claim their place in the district, particularly in the case of older alumni, so who graduated somewhere around the 50s or in the 40s, simultaneously connecting and distancing themselves from Beyoglu. And despite the varying degrees of ethno-nationalism that you could say characterize the memories of some of the alumni, one thing that appears to be abundantly clear in their accounts is that there was no doubt about their sense of belonging in Beyoglu. So the Galatasaray graduates throughout had the period that I was focusing on, so between roughly 1950 and 1980, 1990, claimed their space in very pronounced ways in Beyoglu. To be a student of Galatasaray also therefore meant to be a student in Beyoglu, which counters the idea that the students rejected or resented being in the district, which I mean, the strong connections to ethno-nationalism and the diversity of the district might suggest. So, as one of the graduates suggests in a yearbook, as you know, when one speaks of Beyoglu, Galatasaray High School immediately comes to mind. So, establishing, as it were, a very natural connection, at least in the imagining of the graduates, between Beyoglu and Galatasaray. And throughout its existence, and including the period between 1950 and 1980, Galatasaray High School remained a symbol of elitism, but one deeply intrinsically connected to Beyoglu, despite the district's decidedly negative reputation in urban imaginings, especially the imaginings of new national elites that were also very much produced at Galatasaray High School. I will move now to the second case, which is rather different, though we do see similarities between these processes of placemaking in the case of the Teutonia Club. So, whereas I think most of you will be familiar with the location of the Galatasaray High School, which is sort of at the center of the Istiklal Caddesi, so right at the mid, where the main boulevard takes a slight turn. Teutonia might not be familiar to all of you. It is sort of it is on Galittepe Caddesi, so very close actually also to the Galata Tower. And this building was, since its construction, so in the late 19th century, a node in the life of many of Istanbul's Germans, but would remain to be so also after the Second World War, which is interesting because it had a rather dark past due to the close connections of the club with the Nazi regime during that Second World War. It appears that although the club itself ceased to be a catalyst for connecting Bosporus Germans over the years, its building remained one of the most significant places for social gathering and other activities of significance to German speakers and aspiring German speakers. And with that, gradually, Teutonia became less important as an association that brought together German speakers and instead functioned as a caretaker of its Beyoglu building and catered to the needs of other German speakers. And interestingly, this shift fulfilled something of what could be considered the club's mission to bring together people with an interest in services oriented towards German speakers or those who aspire to learn German. And what the case of Teutonia then demonstrates in the context of Beyoglu is that despite the general neglect of infrastructure and its decline as a residential neighborhood, it remained an important node for German-speaking community and to a significant extent also due to its building. And that again runs directly contrary to more dominant representations of the district between 1950 and 1980 as hazardous and dilapidated, especially in the context of Galata. So, in conclusion, idiosyncratic as these accounts may be, they are also symptomatic for broader trends in Beyoglu in this period between 1950 and 1980 as a place of social gathering, commerce, and culture. So it's an urban space, and as such, it cannot be static. So we see very strong changes in the experiences of place when we look at the rhythm of day and night, and that also contributes to its contested image. And at the same time, the continuities of daytime Beyoglu are undeniable from the preceding period to the current present day, and deserve the attention of urban historians and students of contemporary Istanbul. And if this triggered your interest, I hope it did, of course, and you would like to read about it beyond the article, I also expand on these topics. In my recent book with Ivy Torres, which is called Representing Modern Istanbul. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Enno. I think I speak for most of us, hopefully, when I say that I'm eager to open the book and delve deeper. That's a wonderful image as well. Thank you to all of you for these wonderful presentations. It's so gratifying, when you're working on a project such as this, it becomes this object that you're simply trying to envision and then create in the world, but I'm reminded of all of your eloquence and contributions through your presentations. So health to your hands, health to your tongues. Baki, is there anything more that we should do before we open the question and answer period, or?
I think we could just announce people who would like to ask questions in person should raise their hands, but do that with the raise hand function on Zoom. It's under reactions. You click on that and then you'll see a raise hand function. And if you are camera shy and you don't want to appear on camera, you are most welcome also to send your questions via chat. If you write a question on chat, what we'll do is we'll read it out for the video recording, so it gets recorded, and then whoever receives the question would answer it. So please either raise your hand or write your questions to chat. And in the meantime, of course, the participants, the panel participants, that is the presenters, are most welcome to make comments and ask questions too. I wanted to open the Q&A early because Meryem is leaving, I thought. And so, but that shouldn't preclude the panel participants from making comments and asking questions. And I will simply raise my hand to give a little time for others to think of questions. But if anybody else has questions, for instance, Meryem, if you want to say something before you leave, please go ahead before me.
Just a thank you, and that I'm leaving in a couple of minutes, but I'm leaving my email address in the comment section, so if anybody wanted to email me, they can do that, and an expanded version of the essay comes out in my new book called Reading Silences, so stay tuned.
Well, then I'm going to take my position here as a privilege and ask you a question, not just you. My question was for you and Nagihan together. I have another question, but I'll keep that for later. I was struck by the Nagihan's presentation, where she quoted Ahmet Hamdi with on Balat, layer after layer. There's Islam and the empire, if I remember correctly, right? And yet Balat is the kind of area that is not just Islam. There is so much other than Islam in Balat. And I had felt that earlier, that, in Beşşehir, for instance, the non-Muslim past is not as well represented as the Muslim past in Ottoman cities. In that imagination, I felt like maybe I'm wrong, maybe I didn't read it carefully. And I'm just curious whether remembering this late Ottoman past, is there a slightly different memory for a Muslim sort of cultural figure than for instance, an Armenian woman from Beyoglu? Of course, they're talking about different places. I don't think Ahmet Hamdi wrote about Beyoglu, but I'd be curious how much non-Muslim past comes up in Muslim cultural figures, representations of the past, and how much the majority Muslim past comes up in non-Muslims representations of the past. You can take turns. Maryam is leaving early. Maybe Maryam could say a few things first, and then Nagihan could go next.
So in the case of Liji, I mean, she now lives in Beyoglu, but grew up in Shishli. And so she wrote her book as kind of, as I said, like a first a personal memory. And I think what showed, I mean, not a lot of Muslims are inhabiting her space, and that I think speaks to itself. That maybe those spaces in at least in in the era, in those 100 years that Liji now has lived in Istanbul, they didn't really overlap, right? I mean, their lives and schools, and then married life, and then she goes to France. So I think she didn't have a lot of overlapping with Muslims per se, and maybe that speaks to separated living spaces, a separate kind of spaces that you would like to remember. I'm sure that she has met a lot of people from Muslim people, but I think they just didn't carry meaning for her in that personal space that she created in her memoir. So that would be my reply to your question. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you. Actually, had I continued my presentation, I probably, I've given sort of a lopsided view of how Tanpınar wrote. So allow me to read another quote from him, because both for Tanpınar and Yahya Kemal, Byzance was very, very important, actually. And this is what I wanted to say about the affective bond, this idea of hüzün, which continues, which starts with the Byzantine loss of empire. So my emphasis actually in that quote was the empire rather than Islam. But let me read this quote from Tanpınar. Byzance was not able to raise itself up after the 12th of 04 Latin invasion and looting. The Turkish wave of conquests that came from the east, like a spark from a flame, brought about the salvation of these lands. And of course, that's very interesting because he calls the Turkish conquest salvation from this economic invasion and anarchy of races. So he talks about the Turks arriving in Istanbul as some kind of an antidote to Latin or Catholic or Western Christian impositions. But here is the affective bond, I think. He says the city that had long lost its last masters, lost grammarians and rhetoricians to Venice and Italian cities at large, now saw the birth of another theology, a new mystique, a new aesthetic. In the newly built madrasas, other matters are discussed, other songs are being sung. So, but of course, there's this double thing here, because he's talking about this in the 40s and the 50s. And of course, the grammarians or the theology that replaced the Orthodox one has also been suppressed, this time by Republican theology. So there's these layers of hüzün that compound. So that's why he feels very, very much connected, actually, I would say, to the Christian past.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nagihan. I think Maryam has had to leave us, but we'll try to ventriloquate her if necessary. Müge Hoca, I believe you're next in line.
Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. I mean, one realizes how much one gets when you look at things from the local up, from the bottom up, rather than looking at them in terms of top-down issues. So that in a way we do get much better understanding of what exists within certain spaces, much more detail than we would otherwise. What is very interesting for me, however, is that these are presented in an unproblematic way. And that for me is sort of especially, I think, problematic because you are dealing with a city where differences have often been settled through spatial violation a lot. I mean, you know, I'm thinking of the pogroms. I'm thinking of all the construction now at the expense of all sides, including Muslim ones. I mean, I would have been more interested to find out if the space that you all have looked in your own ways had been problematized from the beginning, as opposed to taking the space as given and then trying to look and describe the various layers. That in itself, I think, is a good analytical exercise, but it doesn't capture the dynamism and the sort of the way in which different aspects, different religions, different perspectives, nationalism, its various different formulations, be it ethnic or religious or what, and how they sort of translate to the police, how they are negotiated on the ground. So that is one thing I would like to ask Jeremy. I mean, you know, when you were putting this volume together, why didn't you sort of think of the spaces in more contested forms, given the anthropological emphasis on identity and differences and contestations of identity? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, thank you, Müge. I think the first response, I mean, of course, the other contributors to the volume should also chime in here, but the first response is simply to echo and assent to your call for a greater focus on contestations. And I certainly agree that some of those moments of contestation that are so spatially rooted and yet also interface with broader logics of the conflicts of identity and political economy in the city are to some degree missing in the papers. I actually think Alize's contribution, perhaps more so than some of the others, gets to that in some of that textured detail. But you know, of course, when you're putting together a conference or a volume like this, you're working with the various interlocutors who come your way. And I do think, but I think that that's not an excuse. It's more just a sort of reflection. I do think, though, that what you might be pointing to perhaps is that when you frame something as a work in memory studies, if you will, since I think that is the loose sort of quasi-disciplinary label that is bringing us all together. And certainly that's been the case with the Empires of Memory project, which you were so kind to lend your voice to as well at one point. I think that there is a sort of implicit depoliticization there, perhaps because you are putting the emphasis on the already settled sites and then trying to read back in this kind of critical genealogy how that settlement occurred, but the contestation in the present is perhaps lacking to some degree. And that's a critique that I take very seriously. And I think I need to, at least in my own work, I need to grapple with a bit more directly. But I see that Alize has raised her hand. Before I turn the microphone over to Alize and then also to Enno, I'm glad to see the eager responses. I will say that on a somewhat more mundane level, I also feel that despite a certain aspiration on my part to really broaden the scope of what we talk about when we talk about Istanbul, we still remained very focused on the central neighborhoods, on the places and spaces that are already familiar through scholarship. I would have loved to have had more work on, say, Beylikdüzü and Sultanbeyli, and, you know, also maybe Polonezköy, if that's even Istanbul. So, but you know, you only are able to assemble what you have in front of you. So inevitably, this is, of course, just a call to further specification and elaboration across the different sites, neighborhood spaces, and places of Istanbul. And I think a lot of those, you know, Ok Meydanı, for instance, these are places where there are more contestations or different contestations than the ones that you see in Taksim Beyoğlu, in Kadıköy, in Sultanahmet. So I'll stop there, but Alize and Enno, please.
Hi, thank you very much, Fatma Hocam, for this very important question. And It is one that I take seriously. And I have kind of two sets of responses to that. The first is, the problematic issue of taking the problematized spaces for granted. So for me, like what maybe motivates my work is, taking what's going on in Tarlabasi for granted, and by extension, other urban transformation projects. And, this, this kind of critique that says, these places are done and, completely, top-down, demolished and so on, which is an important critique. It is an important structural critique. And, it is important to parse out those forms of disposition. But in my work and in this article, what I'm trying to do is to show that these relationships of power are never complete. And there are some more subtle ways in which spaces are still being remade, even within these asymmetrical relations of power. And, in the broader article, that's what I'm endeavoring to do. And I'm hoping that I've accomplished it to some extent. Of course, in 7 minutes, it was a bit difficult to point out. And that brings me to my second comment, based on thinking with you, which is, like your provocation really made me think of problematizing what contestation means as well, right? So, what form can contestation take? Is contestation only when, it's visible or spectacular, or, are these, maybe mundane forms of contestation, like claiming a blurry cell phone photo as a part of history, or maybe as a part of heritage, as a form of claiming a history? Can that be a contestation? And tentatively, my response is yes. So, I would love to think what others think on what contestation come to mean. And also to give, I know that we have a couple of people in the queue, but I'm also curious to see what Çiçek thinks about that as well, because I find her provocation on heritage making as a form of disposition, or as entangled with disposition, very pertinent to this question. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alize. I also think Çiçek's contribution speaks directly to these questions, but Enno and Nagihan are both in the queue. So,
thank you very much, Miguel Hocam, for this very important comment on the unmaking of spaces, which is, of course, in the case of Beyoglu, also a very significant and dominant theme. I do engage with that to some degree in the article, but I would also like to stress here that I believe that it's very important also to focus on exactly these continuities in such a indeed very contested space as Beyoglu, exactly for the reason, and I think that also Alize will recognize this. In the case of Beyoglu, like there's also a lot of suggestion about discontinuity and dilapidation, which is then instrumentalized by private and public parties exactly to cater to their own agendas, which is often urban redevelopment and urban destruction. And by actually showing that indeed Beyoglu is a significant place, is not, in the words of Ahmet Misbah Demircan, a poisoned prince, or like in I mean, and this is echoes, like different generations. It echoes also, of course, like the words of Bedrettin Dalan in the 1980s, by focusing exactly on the significance of Beyoglu in the spaces that have persevered throughout the destruction of communities and of spaces. We also, in that sense, have a way, in that sense, to make a fist against these, new interventions. You could argue, I think, and this is, for instance, also shown in a case that I don't discuss in this article, but in my book, which is the case of the Cercle d'Orient buildings. There we do indeed see that we have successive layers of contestation, but that new generation also engage with new layers of destruction in different ways. And it is exactly because people were not able to negotiate these continuities also, or not significantly enough. I think that policymakers and private parties were more successful in destroying much of those buildings, which included TMX Cinema. So yes, I think indeed it's very significant to focus exactly on the trauma, which is very visible and maybe indeed, as the previous speaker also said, somewhat quote unquote spectacular, but it's also very important to keep focusing on actually what remains in these spaces, because that is also, I think, an effort that fits into the heritage preservation effort.
Thank you, Enno. Nagihan.
Yes, let me also thank Fatma Müge Hoca. I was thinking I could do this presentation like a history of violence as well. I could just focus on that bits, actually, which I touch upon the paper. I do talk about the pogroms, and I do talk about the discursive violence of how the name places change, particularly with Evliya and stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Çiçek.
Thanks a lot for the provocation. It actually, what you were trying to head on is actually lies at the very basis of my research. What motivates my research is to actually track the invisibilized translations of continuous state violence. And since my focus in this particular article was on heritage making practices, I try to see how particular state violence acts has been translated systematically into silent stories of dispossession when it comes to certain type of heritageized buildings. So in the article, I dwell into, so I basically contextualize individual cases of dispossessions within the continuous state violence history. So I stop here. Thank you.
Baki, I see you have a question or comment.
Yes. First of all, I just wanted to remind, thank Müge Hoca for her very good question, and also just remind her that there was a whole section in the volume that we couldn't cover today because we had to make sort of strategic decisions about how much of the volume we could represent in one WhatsApp session, and that is the roundtable, lessons of the past for Hagia Sophia's present and future. Jeremy very briefly touched upon that when he introduced the dossier, but I believe if we had another WhatsApp on that, I think some of the issues you raised could have been addressed more directly, maybe, because that is sort of a very obvious case for the question you raised, Müge Hocam. There is Umut Azak, Patricia Blessing, and Ali Yagioğlu, Merih Danalı, Marcus Dressler, Shannon Steiner, and Emily Neumeier, Bisera Pencheva, İpek Kocaömer Yosmoğlu, and Ethem Eldem in that roundtable. And Jeremy and I thought having this and that in one WhatsApp would be just impossible to handle. So maybe if we'll do another one for that, and then maybe we could address this question you raised, perhaps provide it as a sort of starting point to light up discussion, and also to ask everybody to address more directly, and then that might actually be a way of taking it in. My question was going to be to Çiğdem, and it's also to Jeremy, and it's a very general question, and it is related to my own interest now. I have been thinking about disenchantment very much, and actually I just published in Turkish a piece. disenchantment is usually translated as büyü bozumu in Turkish social sciences. I employed a different term, sır yetimi, sır, esrar, sort of demystification, if you like, because I sort of posited an enchanted Middle Ages where certain forms of Sufism with its emphasis on sır, which Shahab Ahmed makes a great point about, reminding us how important the concept of sır is, secret is, and an enchanted Middle Ages where the boundary between the divine and the human was much more porous. This world and other worlds could be transcrossed very easily, versus a disenchanted sort of modernity in which that boundary is, more or less fixed, more relatively speaking. And I tried to suggest that this is not simply a matter of modernity that comes to us from, colonialism. It is something that actually was happening within the early modern period. I tried to interpret Kadızadeli's as a way of thinking through this, because when you think about all the things that they really cared about and made a big fuss about in the 17th century, they are all related to questions of enchantment and disenchantment, I think. And so even this question of the tombs, while Katip Çelebi or Naima do not necessarily talk about this in direct detail, we do know Kadızade was sort of also blamed for not respecting the saints. There is a Mevlevi story about how in Konya he disrespected the tomb of Rumi, etc. And they were in general kind of questioning sainthood. They were trying to question the sainthood concept, etc. So I'm just curious, in terms of conceptualizing this from the social sciences, I do definitely see the point of how modernity is not completely disenchanted. You're absolutely right. We don't live in a completely disenchanted world. We are still enchanted. But on the other hand, is this just a matter of modernity? Weren't there like precursors of this before the modern started, through the making of this category of religion and the secular, the private and the public? Because I think it is possible to kind of draw a line that starts a little earlier and before the impact of the colonial West onto the Ottoman Empire. And I'm curious, is there any like conceptual thinking about this in the social sciences? One thing that Çiğdem said about differentiating between secular and modern, I found very helpful, because I think it is perhaps difficult to argue for a secular right in the 16th century, but I'm more inclined to see something modern in the 16th century sort of coming out. Anyway, I talk too much. I'm just interested in your reflections on what I said, so that I can hear how social scientists look at this, the pre-modern past.
Shall I start, Jeremy?
How best to handle this, because Mige also wanted to chime in on the first part, but maybe we can respond.
No, I'll give it to Çiğdem. I just wanted to say a few things, but it follows also from what Baki says, so I'll wait until Çiğdem responds. Thank you.
Okay, I might say a few things after Çiğdem as well, but please.
Baki Hocam, I know about your article, but I haven't had the chance to read it yet, and I definitely want to read it. I'm not an Ottoman historian, so I cannot, I know about the Kadızadeli, I read a little bit about it, and you're definitely right. They actually make such a distinction between enchantment and disenchantment in the terms that they disobey these saint venerations, disrespect tombs, and other customs they try to instill into the Islamic practice at the time, or they try to ban many of the things that the folk, the common folk Islam, let's say, continues to do still. The social scientists, yes, they make a differentiation between the secular and the religious, but that is dated to the, I think, 18th century, because, or maybe a little bit earlier, to the Latin word religio, because this Latin word religio is taken in the Western languages as a specific set of rules instead of the previous pre-modern classical notions of religion in other languages, such as ancient Greek, the Ottoman Din, and many others, which did not actually differentiate between the secular and the religious. I mean, there was no concept of the secular before. That's got a history of it, and of course, it doesn't go back to the 16th century, like you say. But there should be some similar movements within other religious systems as well. And Catholicism, for instance, I don't know it too well either, but they can be dated before the 18th century, 17th century. And I mean, these instances perhaps represent what is to come, and how the view towards enchantment is evolving in the history. Yeah, I know it from literature a little bit, from Ottoman literature, from what Walter Andrews and Mehmet Kalpaklı talk about the 16th century Ottoman classical literature. There, they identify that this culture of love exists. I mean, probably you know about that it exists also in the Western literature. So the Ottomans and the Western literatures both share this culture of love. And after the 16th century, this classical age, what happens in the West is that this culture of love and the beloved disappears, whereas it remains in a fragmented form in the Ottoman culture. So here we see these parts of the whole enchantment because it is directly related to the Sufi culture, the love of poetry as well. So we have it in a fragmented version, and Kadızadeli movement was repressed as far as I know. So it stayed in a fragmented version, but it found its way back into the culture again. That's all I can say about it.
Thank you so much. And I was not expecting you, having read my article. It just appeared and it's in Turkish and it's not available online. So yeah. Don't worry about that. But I can tell you, I do argue that the Kadızadeli influence on Turkish Islam is much more than it is usually recognized. Anyway, Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just briefly, if I could chime in here quickly, I won't go into some of the historiographic detail that Çiğdem did, but thinking back to Nagihan's essay and presentation as well, I think we're probably all a bit exhausted by hüzün at this point, but it is important to recall that Pamuk is very insistent on hüzün not being translatable to melancholy, precisely because it has this collective tarikat origin as a sort of communal affect, right? So there's something to be said about that. More generally, you know, I think one of the aspirations of this collection and much of what I've been trying to write about and think about recently is to sort of initiate a kind of critical re-enchantment with spaces that inhabit the past and which the past inhabits, particularly urban spaces. And in that respect, and this is going to be a very strange sort of circuitous route that I'm very briefly going to draw for you. But in that respect, as Číček at least knows quite well, Walter Benjamin's work has been extraordinarily productive. I have this essay, which is in a very strange context related to the anthropologist Tim Ingold's work, but I tried to coin this concept of metrosophy, metro and Sophie as a sort of neologism, but drawing on his notion of the porosity of urban spaces as a sort of undoing of kind of the modern forms of distinction and separation that we take for granted. And of course, he writes about porosity vis-a-vis Naples. There's also a strange sort of connection to Ottoman pasts in some of his work, precisely because he's being influenced by Gershom Scholem, who of course was the great thinker of Sabbatai Sevi. So that's another line of flight. But writing about Naples makes me think about a certain comparison. So I'm sending this to everyone. You'll remember from my initial presentation, the Istanbul, they call it chaos, we call it home. Well, the other, if you click on that, you'll see the other city that is frequently invoked with that same slogan is Naples. So perhaps there's something to think about there. Perhaps a Mediterranean porosity and the enchantment of the urban is some title for a future reflection. But I do agree also, Baki, that we should gather the Hagia Sophia contributors together, and maybe that's a way of turning back to Miguel Hoja's comments, perhaps.
Let me just say a few things, because thank you very much for your responses and also for developing it further. I think what I see as the problem here is sort of the theoretical level and the empirical level as well. I do agree, Baki, that it's not enough to talk about Western modernity as the impact. I mean, that's what I've been trying to see, is how do you bring the local dynamics into explaining what's going on. With respect to that, I think what becomes very important in the third, there are sort of three things that become very important. First is the boundary formation. If you want to sort of think about it, Frank Parkin in sociology writes about boundaries. Michel Lamont also talks about boundaries in the more cultural sense. In the sense, I think what happens initially is definitely a heterodox-orthodox tension that is also, of course, very much a Sunni Alevi tension between the Iranian and the Ottoman empires and such. So I would say there is a boundary with respect to, I would say, what is presented as the discourse and what is practiced. And I think that is a distinction we really have to make very carefully, because what is said and what is done are very different from each other. In the sense that, that is why maybe taking narratives alone is not enough. You have to look how much those narratives then find meaning in the ground, in praxis. I think that is sort of the first thing we do not look at in terms of boundary formation. How do we, according, for example, like Turkey, like all the other things, is supposed to be a democracy and everything. But if you look at the praxis now, you see that it's not, there are so many human rights allegations, interventions. Is there, democracy? To what degree? That's why it's so important to look at the praxis as well as what's said and described. The second one has to do with social actors. When Jeremy said, well, I only look at sort of why what remains and sort of becomes hegemonic, I totally get it. But it partially becomes hegemonic because we're only focusing on the actual contributions of certain actors, in this case, of course, national, ethnic, Sunni, white Muslim actors, as opposed to others that have been erased through history, even though there are still some remaining there, like of course, non-Muslim ones, as well as sort of the Alevis and others, and Kurds and such. So what the problem is that when we're looking at actors, we shouldn't only look at the actors that are there. We should also look at the actors that have been erased at the same time. Foucault would say that is, how you get to the silences is by trying to give agency to the actors who have been silenced. So that would be the second way. And the third is, I think, to put things in more context, Jeremy, you sort of say that is what you did with Naples and everything. But then that brings to me a third very important critical self-reflexivity, and that's of the scholar. Who we are also emphasizes what we study. I mean, you know, I, for a very long time, because of my location, you know, as a white Turk, upper class white Turk, was able to see certain things go in hook, line, and sinker, the official history, and I never sort of questioned what was left out until I started studying minorities. So, I mean, of which I wasn't one, and I've always said that. I mean, I think we also have to engage in this critical discourse with ourselves and maybe bring that as a part of our explanation as well. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Müge. This is, you know, I mean, absolutely. I think drawing, particularly trying to draw as many different positions and perspectives, not for the sake of some sort of happy heteroglossic kind of multicultural reason, but precisely because the very questions that are asked from different perspectives on the past and on the present and on the city and on the nation produces a different sort of knowledge. And, you know, it's a project that I think hopefully we all aspire to contribute to, even as we all are stumbling against our own privileges in certain ways. I mean, what you said made me think about my own curious positionality now based in Croatia, where, you know, on the one hand, I have a very immense privilege as a white American male. At the same time, there are things here that seem so obvious to me that seem just, you know, to be glossed over in public discourse, precisely related to questions of both the Ottoman and in this case, Yugoslav and Habsburg past. So again, you know, the biographical and the historical meet in strange ways. So I'll just ramble on if I continue to speak. I don't know if there's anyone with their hand up at the moment, or did we have any comments in the comment section? I think I haven't fully.
I think there is nothing left, and also we actually went quite above and beyond the usual 90 minutes. We are almost at 2 hours, so I think it's time to wrap up here. And I really would like to thank Jeremy most for bringing this volume together, this special dossier, and then Nükhet, who's not here, for you know, pulling that volume out, because the special dossier is much thicker. And also in this volume, you'll also find sort of the Voices of Emerging Scholars series making its appearance. Many very young PhDs or very recent PhDs, very short pieces. And then there are also standalone articles. And as a result, the volume ran by, I'll tell you, about 500 pages. So that is not the case with 8.2. 8.2, just to have you a comparison, is 360 pages. So this volume in which this special dossier appeared was a very special one. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for editing the dossier. Thank you so much for all the participants who are here, the panel participants for contributing to the dossier. And thank you so much for the participants at the Zoom meeting for your questions, especially Müge Hocam. Thank you so much for making time to attend it, and you know, giving us a good point to discuss, and maybe being the reason for a follow-up with the maybe Hagia Sophia dialogue to continue this special issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Thank you, Baki. Thank you, all of the contributors. Thank you to the audience, Müge Hocam. I just want to say one more thanks to Nükhet, because she really saved this. It was floundering on the shoals of, well, just too much work to do and too many different competing priorities. And then we had the volume in process with one journal and it just didn't work out. So even though she's not here, she really deserves great credit. And Baki, we'll talk about maybe a follow-up event as well.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Hoşça kalın.